She was chained to a tree, left to die in a blizzard, until a shadow with a knife rode out of the storm. Snow poured from the sky like shards of jagged glass, sharp and endless. It buried the world in a thick, heavy silence, but there was no peace in it, just a cold, biting edge. Beneath a gnarled pine tree, twisted and bent by decades of fierce wind, a woman dangled in chains. Her name was Clara Hensley. Her breaths came shallow, each one a weak, ghostly puff against the darkening dusk. Her wrists were torn and bloody, scraped raw by the rusted iron ring hammered deep into the tree's bark. Whoever forged that ring had cruelty in their heart. It wasn't just meant to hold. It was meant to punish. She'd stopped screaming hours ago. Her voice cracked and faded long before her hope did, though both hung by a thread now, fragile and fraying. The storm hadn't paused for a full day and night. Snow climbed past her ankles, then her shins, soaking through the tattered hem of her dress. Once a bright blue cotton, it was now a dull, filthy gray, streaked with mud, sweat, and dark red stains of blood. Her boots were gone, yanked off her feet in a violent struggle. Her toes had turned a sickly purple-white, stiff as the frozen branches around her. She couldn't feel them anymore. She wasn't even sure her heart was still beating. The forest around her stood eerily still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The trees loomed like silent watchers, their branches heavy with snow, judging her from above. The wind slithered between them, moaning low and mournful, like a widow weeping for a lost love. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote let out a sharp, lonely cry that echoed through the woods. Closer, much closer, a raven swooped down and perched on a branch just above her head. Its black eyes glinted with a strange, cold curiosity, almost like it was sizing her up. She might have spoken to it, might have asked it why it stared, but her throat was swollen shut from the biting cold, her voice trapped inside her chest. Time warped into frost. Minutes dragged on like hours, then snapped back, rewinding in her mind. But through it all, she remembered every single moment that brought her here, etched into her memory with a clarity that burned like fire on her skin. 3 days earlier, her husband's grave was still fresh, a mound of damp, dark earth piled behind their small cabin. She'd marked it herself with a crude wooden cross, carving his name into it with her sewing scissors. Thomas Hensley, husband, honest. The words felt empty now. Grief didn't have a voice left to speak. It had settled deep into her bones, heavy and gray like ash after a fire. She'd planned to keep the homestead going on her own, the way she always had, truth be told. Tom was handy with the cattle, sure, but it was Clara who patched the leaky roof in the rain, who shot the foxes that stalked the chickens, who planted the barley rows every spring. She could do it alone. She had to. Then Silas Boone showed up, her husband's brother. He rolled in with 2 rough-looking men, Jed Carver and Rafe Mullins, all 3 stinking of cheap whiskey and worse intentions. He didn't bother knocking on her door. He just pushed it open and strode inside, boots thudding on her floorboards, acting like he was king of her home. He said he'd come for her safety, said a woman couldn't survive out here unprotected, alone in the wild. Said the land, their land, should go to someone who could use it proper. "Marry me," he'd said, flashing a grin that twisted her stomach into knots. It's the Christian thing to do. You keep your name, I keep the land. Simple. His eyes glinted with greed, not kindness. She spat at his boots, right there in her own parlor. That night, they didn't ask again. They tied her up with coarse rope, her wrists burning as she fought. They dragged her out into the forest, her heels scraping the dirt, then the snow, like she was nothing more than a sack of grain to be tossed away. Silas struck her hard across the face when she sank her teeth into his hand, drawing blood. "Witch," he snarled. "Devil woman. Barren widow." He spat the words like venom. Said she bewitched Tom, made him die in his sleep. Said she talked to the wind too much, listened to it like it spoke back, and never cried like a proper widow should. Said leaving her out here for the coyotes was justice, a punishment she deserved. He chained her to the tree with a thick logging chain, the kind used to haul felled timber, and locked it tight. Then he tossed the key into the icy creek nearby, grinning as it sank out of sight. He, Jed, and Rafe turned and left, their laughter ringing in her ears until the trees swallowed a whole. Now her skin clung to the iron like damp cloth sticking to an open wound. She tried to twist free so many times. Hours of pulling, yanking, scraping. That blood had run down her arms, freezing solid at her elbows. It cracked and split when she moved, sending sharp stabs of pain through her. Her tongue felt thick, like a wad of wool stuffed in her mouth. She couldn't swallow, couldn't form words to pray, couldn't even whisper for help. She glared up at the raven perched above her. "You here to watch me die?" she croaked, her voice so faint it barely rustled the air, weaker than the wind brushing the grass. The bird didn't answer, just tilted its head, flapped its wings once, and stayed put, indifferent to her suffering. Then, snap, a sound in the distance, sharp and sudden. Her body stiffened, every muscle locking tight. Her heart thudded hard, jolting her numb limbs awake with a surge of raw fear. Another crack echoed through the trees. Footsteps crunching snow, a branch breaking under weight, a rider, maybe. She tried to call out, to scream for help, but all that came was a wet, choking rasp. She coughed, and a thin trickle of blood dribbled down her chin, staining the snow beneath her. Her ears strained against the silence that followed, desperate for another sign. Nothing. Then hooves, faint at first, but growing louder, steady, deliberate, cutting through the storm toward her. She blinked hard, tears freezing into icy streaks on her lashes. Her vision doubled, swam, blurred at the edges. From between the snow-laden trees, a shape emerged. A horse, black as coal, moving slow and careful through the drifts. On its back sat a man, wrapped head to toe in thick furs and rawhide. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath a tangle of snow-matted hair and a dark scarf pulled tight against the wind. Who was he? Friend? Foe? Her mind raced, but her body couldn't move. He saw her. The rider stopped a few feet away, his horse snorting clouds of steam into the air. He slid off without a sound and stepped toward her, his boots sinking into the snow. He moved like a ghost, silent, weightless, eerie in the fading light. She tried to speak, to beg or warn or plead, but her jaw wouldn't budge, locked tight by cold and exhaustion. He knelt in front of her, close enough that she could see his eyes narrow as he took her in. They were brown, so dark they looked almost black, sharp and unreadable beneath the shadow of his hood. He studied her, the bruises blooming on her face, the chain biting into her wrists, the cracked, frost-bitten skin of her hands and feet. She waited for him to say something, anything, a question, a curse, even a grunt of pity. Nothing came. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then he reached beneath his cloak and pulled out a long hunting knife, its blade gleaming faintly in the dusk. Her breath caught in her throat, a weak gasp that barely made a sound. Was this it? Had he come to end her, to finish what Silas started? Her heart hammered, but she couldn't look away. He raised the knife slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on hers, steady, piercing, giving nothing away. She braced herself, too weak to fight, too tired to care. But then, with a single fluid motion, he drove the blade between the chain and the tree trunk. He twisted hard, metal grinding against metal, and with a loud snap, the rusted iron ring broke free from its anchor. The chain crashed to the ground, coiling in the snow like a dead serpent, its weight finally gone. Clara's legs gave out beneath her, and she crumpled forward. He caught her just before her head hit the snow, his arms strong but careful, holding her like she was something fragile yet worth saving. She wanted to scream, to cry, to thank him, anything, but her voice was gone, her body limp as a rag doll. Her heart pounded too fast, erratic like it might burst. He didn't ask who she was, didn't say who he was, didn't explain a thing. He just pulled a thick buffalo hide from his saddlebag, wrapped it around her trembling frame, and lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed no more than a child. He climbed up behind her, one arm steadying her against his chest as he took the reins. His warmth seeped through the furs, burning against her icy skin, almost painful after so long in the cold. The snow kept falling, thick and relentless, as they rode away from the tree. She didn't look back, couldn't bear to see it standing there, the place where she'd nearly died. Her mind fogged, thoughts slipping away like water through her fingers. She passed out not long after, her last fragmented thoughts a jumble of sounds and sensations. Her husband's name whispered in her head, the clatter of the chain hitting the ground, the faint, unfamiliar glow of human kindness cutting through the dark. When she woke, night had fallen. A fire crackled beside her, its orange light casting long, shifting shadows across a rough stone wall. She was in a cave, wrapped tight in layers of furs that smelled faintly of smoke and earth. Her hands were bandaged, the cloth soft against her raw skin. Her feet, too, were warm, tucked into fur-lined wraps. She turned her head, wincing as stiff muscles protested. He sat across the fire, the stranger who'd saved her, hunched over his hunting knife, wiping it clean with a rag. In the flickering light, she could see him better now. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, though his face carried the weight of more years. High cheekbones stood sharp beneath weathered skin, his long black hair tied back loosely, strands falling free. A deep scar ran from his jaw down to his neck, jagged and old, a mark of some brutal fight he'd survived. He wore no insignia, no badge, no sign of any tribe or nation, just simple leather and bone, practical and worn. Silence clung to him like a second skin. "Water," she croaked, her voice a dry rasp that scratched her throat. He didn't look up, just reached for a gourd beside him and passed it over without a word. The water was cool, sweet, sliding down her parched throat like a blessing. She drank deeply, gulping it down as if it might vanish if she stopped. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with a shaky hand and studied him again. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice still weak but clearer now. He didn't answer, his focus on the knife. "You don't talk much, huh?" she pressed, frowning. Still nothing, just the scrape of cloth on steel. She leaned forward slightly, the furs rustling. "What? Are you some kind of forest spirit, wandering around saving dying women?" I got a reaction. He looked up at her finally, his dark eyes meeting hers, and his voice came low and rough, like stones grinding together. "No, just a man passing through." She stared at him, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. "Thank you," she said after a moment, the words feeling small compared to what he'd done. He nodded once, a short, final gesture, like that was all he needed to say on it. "I'm Clara," she added, her voice steadier now. "I know," he replied, calm as ever. Her breath hitched in her chest, a jolt of confusion cutting through her. "Ow!" she demanded, louder this time. Before she could press further, he stood and moved to the cave's entrance, peering out into the swirling snow and darkness beyond, his silhouette framed against the night. "What do you know about me?" she called after him, her voice rising with a mix of fear and curiosity. He turned his head just enough for her to catch the faintest curve of a smile, barely there, gone in a blink. "I know you didn't cry when they chained you," he said, then stepped out into the dark to keep watch, leaving her alone with the fire and her racing thoughts. She sat there, stunned. How could he know that? Who was this man, this quiet stranger who'd pulled her from death without asking a single question? She didn't understand him, didn't know where they were headed or why he'd bothered to save her. But for the first time in days, warmth seeped into her bones. For the first time in months, Maybe years she felt seen, truly seen, and that realization hit her harder than the cold ever could. It terrified her, more than the storm, more than the chain. Who was he? And what did he want? The cave smelled sharp, of wood smoke and sticky pine sap, mingling with the damp musk of stone. The warmth from the fire coiled around Clara like a hesitant friend, welcome but hard to trust after so long in the freezing dark. She shifted beneath the heavy furs, her body groaning as it woke up. Every muscle ached, stiff from the cold and the strain of hanging in those chains. Her nerves buzzed back to life, sharp and stinging, like wasps crawling under her skin. Across the fire, he sat motionless, a statue carved from shadow and flame. He hadn't spoken since dropping that line about her name, hadn't asked her anything, hadn't reached for her again after carrying her in. That silence unnerved her more than anything else. In her world, kindness always came with strings attached, a debt to be paid later. This man offered nothing but the crackle of the fire and the weight of his quiet presence. She studied him closer in the shifting light. His cheekbones caught the glow, high and proud, his eyes reflecting the flames like twin sparks. He wasn't young, not old either, just lived in, the kind of face that had seen hard days and buried harder nights. Scars marked his arms, faint lines crisscrossing his skin, and that deep one slash from the left side of his throat down to his collarbone. Long, mean, healed rough. Whatever blade made that mark had wanted him dead and failed miserably. She cleared her throat, the sound loud in the stillness. "You got a name?" she asked again, softer this time. He didn't look away from the fire, just kept tending it with a stick. "Coda," he said finally, the word short and solid. She tested it under her breath, Coda. It felt like a name rooted in the earth, steady and real, not soft or fleeting. "You're Lakota, aren't you?" she said, almost defensive, like she needed to prove she wasn't clueless. He gave a small nod, barely a tilt of his head. "My husband used to trade with your people," she went on, filling the silence. "Barley, smoked pork, sometimes bolts of cloth. He always said the Lakota rode quieter than the wind itself." Coda glanced at her then, and for a split second, the corner of his mouth twitched upward, a smirk, faint and fleeting, gone before she could be sure. Was he mocking her? Agreeing? Maybe both. She couldn't read him, and that made her uneasy. "I thought I was going to die out there," she said, her voice steadier now, though it trembled at the edges. "I would have if you hadn't come along." He poked at the fire, sending sparks swirling up into the dark. "You still might," he replied, not cruel, just honest, his tone flat as the snow outside. That shut her up for a moment. She stared into the flames, watching them dance and snap. He'd bandaged her hands with care, wrapped her frostbitten feet in soft fur and linen. Someone had taken the time to do that. Someone who didn't even know her. "Why? Why'd you help me?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him again. Coda leaned back against the cave wall, folding his arms across his chest, the furs shifting with him. "I saw smoke," he said. "Thought it might be a trapper's fire. Found the chain first, then your tracks in the snow, then you." "That's not what I meant," she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the haze of the firelight. He met her gaze, his eyes steady and unreadable. "Most men don't survive being left like that," he said. "Women even less. You were still breathing." That was enough. She let that sink in, turning it over in her mind. Not a savior, not some noble knight in furs, just a man who didn't walk past a dying thing. It wasn't the answer she'd expected, but it settled something in her chest, heavy and real. "You knew my name," she said, circling back to it, her tone cautious. He nodded again, slow and deliberate. "Found a leather pouch by your saddle. Your journal was inside. You write when you're angry." Her face went hot, a flush creeping up her neck despite the cold. "You read it?" she asked, half accusing, half embarrassed. "Enough," he said, shrugging one shoulder. "You write like someone punching through the paper." That pulled a laugh from her, dry, raspy, the first she'd managed in months. It echoed oddly in the cave, hollow and strange. Didn't know anyone would ever read it, she muttered, looking down at her bandaged hands. Didn't know anyone would save you, he countered, his voice low but pointed. Silence stretched out between them. Not hostile, just full, like the air before a storm. Outside, the wind had softened, the snow falling in slow, lazy sheets, muffling the world beyond the cave. Clara listened to it. The gentle hush of flakes piling up, the sharp pop of pine sap bursting in the fire. It was calming almost after everything. You got family? She asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Coda shrugged, a small roll of his shoulders. No home, he said. West, east, wherever the horse walks. She nodded, lips pressed tight. I had both once, she said, her voice quieter now. Husband's dead. Family left me for the coyotes. He looked at her then, his gaze steady. Then we're alike, he said. She blinked, caught off guard. Both ghosts, he added, and something in her chest twisted. Not pain, but recognition, a shared weight neither of them asked for. Do you believe in signs? Coda asked, breaking the silence. She frowned. Omens. Ravens mean something, he said, nodding outside. Yours watched you, cried once, flew north, led me to you. Lucky bird, she muttered. No luck, he said, firm. He stood, grabbed dried meat and water, handed them to her, fingers brushing hers. She ate slow, jaw sore, stomach hesitant, the tough, smoky meat giving strength. Where we going? She asked, wiping her mouth. Somewhere safer, he said, adding a log to the fire, sparks rising. Real place or hope? She pressed, doubtful. He adjusted the flames. Canyon, 2 days off, hidden with water game. I know the way. You live there. No, he said. You will. She stopped chewing, gut sinking. Leaving me? She asked, sharp. Why? He met her eyes, calm. You'll walk soon, hunt, shoot. Then you won't need me. I didn't ask for your help. She snapped, heat rising in her chest, sharp and defensive. He didn't flinch, just held her gaze. You didn't have to, he said, and there was no pity in it, just truth. She hated that answer, hated how it rang so clear, cutting through her anger like a blade. She pulled the fur tighter around herself, turning her eyes back to the fire, watching the flames twist and leap. You ever lose someone? She asked after a while, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. He didn't answer right away, the silence stretching long enough that she thought he wouldn't. Then, too many, he said, his tone low and rough. Brother, wife, daughter. Clara flinched, a pang of guilt hitting her for asking. I'm sorry, she said, meaning it. He shrugged again, a small, tired motion. I speak their names in dreams. That's enough. She didn't know what to say to that. Tom's name burned on her tongue, a weight she couldn't yet release. Not here, not now. The wind picked up outside, rattling through the trees like a warning. Coda stood suddenly, moving to the cave mouth, his stance shifting, alert, tense like a hawk spotting prey. What is it? Clara asked, her voice tight with sudden fear. Riders, he said, flat and certain, his eyes scanning the dark beyond. Her blood turned cold, a shiver running down her spine. They followed me? She whispered, dread pooling in her stomach. Maybe your blood in the snow, he said. Maybe mine. She forced herself to her feet, legs wobbling like a newborn foal's, weak but stubborn. How many? 3, maybe 4, he said. Too far to count yet. Silas? She asked, her fists clenching hard enough to hurt, nails digging into her palms. Could be, he replied, his voice steady but edged with something dark. She stumbled toward the saddlebag in the corner, her hands shaking as she dug through it. She found her rifle, old, beat up, but familiar, its weight of comfort in her grip. She loaded it with trembling fingers, the metal clicking as bullets slid into place. Her breath came fast now, hot and ragged in her throat, fogging the air in front of her. Kota watched her, his expression unreadable. "You shoot well enough?" he asked, his tone neutral. She gritted her teeth, jaw tight. "Good enough," she said, and she meant it. He nodded. No praise, no doubt, just acceptance like he trusted her to prove it. They moved fast, doused the fire with handfuls of snow, the hiss of steam rising as the flames died. They covered their tracks as best they could, brushing snow over footprints, hiding any sign they'd been there. Kota packed light, tying the horse's reins tight to keep it silent. He pointed to a narrow path at the back of the cave, a steep climb between jagged rocks leading up into the woods. They went together, moving quiet and steady, her rifle clutched tight, his bow slung across his back. Behind them, the sound of hooves grew louder, closer, a steady thudding that matched the pounding in her ears. Her knees threatened to buckle with every step, but she pushed on, the cold air slicing her lungs like glass. She glanced at Kota. He moved like smoke, no sound, no hesitation, no trace of fear. She wanted that, craved it, wanted to be that strong, that sure, to never feel a chain around her wrists again. They reached the top of the ridge and ducked into the trees, crouching low in the shadows. Below, 4 riders appeared, their shapes dark against the snow. They stopped near the cave, dismounting with heavy steps. She recognized one instantly, Silas Boone. That coat, with its broken shoulder strap, the way he slouched forward in the saddle like he was whispering poison to the horse. Her stomach churned, rage and fear twisting together. She raised her rifle, her hand steady now, the trembling gone. Kota didn't stop her, just watched, his bow ready. "You know how to kill?" he asked, his voice low, testing her. "I know how not to die," she said, her eyes locked on the men below. He nodded, slow and deliberate, a flicker of approval in his gaze. "Aim for the one who smiles first," he said, and she could hear the edge in it. Strategy, not cruelty. A gust of wind ripped through the pines, bending branches low, groaning like mourners at a funeral. Clara watched the riders, her breath shallow, her finger resting light on the trigger. They were close now, too close. What would they do if they found her? Drag her back? Chain her again? Worse? Suspense hung thick in the air, her pulse racing. She didn't fire. Not yet. She looked at Kota. His eyes burned with fire, but there was something else there too. Respect, raw and real. The riders moved toward the cave, searching, sniffing out their trail. She exhaled slow, her breath a faint cloud. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice trembling with determination. "No," Kota agreed, his tone dark and certain. "It's just begun." The wind howled down the ridge like a blade, slicing through the night. Clara lay belly flat against the frozen earth, the cold seeping through her furs into her bones. Her rifle rested in her arms, the wooden stock fogged by her quick, shallow breaths. Below, the riders dismounted near the cave entrance, their boots crunching loud in the snow. 4 of them, 4 dark figures against the white, but to her, they might as well have been an army. One struck a match and lit a lantern, its weak yellow glow spilling across the ground. Another kicked at the ashes of their doused fire, cursing loud enough for his voice to carry up the hill. Then she saw him, Silas Boone. Even from this distance, she knew him by the way he moved, that swaggering strut, like he owned the world and every shattered piece in it. His coat flapped behind him, a tattered flag of warning, the broken strap swinging loose. Seeing him again lit a fire in her gut, bitter, primal, a mix of hate and something deeper, something that wanted to claw its way out. Her fingers tightened on the rifle, knuckles whitening. Kota lay beside her, still as a stone, one knee bent, his bow gripped tight like an extension of his arm. He nodded once, permission or caution. She couldn't tell, but it steadied her. She waited, watching, her finger hovering near the trigger. Her pulse thudded loud in her ears, a war drum beating faster with every second. Then one of the riders turned, his head tilting as he squinted up the hill toward their hiding spot. Did he see her? Her breath stopped. She didn't think. She fired. The shot cracked through the air like thunder, splitting the silence. The man spun backward, a howl ripping from his throat as he clutched his shoulder, blood blooming red against the snow behind him. The forest erupted into chaos. Coda jumped up, bow drawn, arrow flying fast into a rider's throat by the cave. The man fell, choking, blood spilling. Screams erupted, panic fury. Silas shouted orders, firing wildly into the trees. Bullets zipped past Clara, hitting bark. She ducked behind a pine, heart pounding, reloading her rifle with shaky hands she steadied. Her shot missed, stirring snow. Coda slid down the slope, a shadow with a flashing knife, stabbing the third rider in the ribs. He dropped silently. Only Silas was left. Clara knelt, aiming, fear fading. His gun shook, scared or cold. Spotting Coda, he ran for the horses, slipping. Clara fired, missing, the bullet ricocheting off a rock. Silas hid behind a boulder, panting, gun ready. She slid down after Coda, pulse racing, reaching the clearing. Two lay dead, one bled out, groaning. She stepped over him, eyes on Silas's hiding spot. His voice rang out, sharp and taunting. "You really teaming up with a savage now, Clara? That what you are, some Redskins whore?" The words hit her like a slap, burning hot in her chest. She leveled her rifle at the rock, her voice cutting through the air, loud and steady. "Come out, Silas." "No," he snarled back, his tone dripping with venom. "You're gonna freeze out here again, girl. Should have taken my offer. Could have kept the farm, had a warm bed, a roof over your damn head." Coda moved to the side, circling silent around the boulder's edge. Clara saw it, and so did Silas. "You think he's saving you?" Silas shouted, his voice rising with desperation. "You're just a ghost to him, another sad little white girl left to rot in the dirt." "I've got a rifle," Clara replied, her tone ice cold, unwavering. "And I'm not chained anymore." She heard his breath catch, a sharp hitch of fear. Coda's shadow stretched long behind the boulder, creeping closer. Silas turned too late. Coda didn't use the knife this time. He lunged, slamming into Silas with his full weight, a hard tackle that knocked the wind out of him. One swift move, and Coda twisted the gun from Silas's grip, sending it spinning into the snow. Silas scrambled after it, clawing at the ground, but Clara was faster. She stepped forward, planted her boot on the revolver, pinning it down. He froze, his breath ragged, eyes darting up to meet hers. She aimed her rifle at his face, the barrel steady, inches from his forehead. "Go ahead," Silas spat, his voice trembling but defiant, blood trickling from a split lip where he'd hit the ground. "You're not a killer, Clara." She said nothing, her silence louder than any shout. His lip curled into a sneer, his eyes wild. "You never had the stomach for it. That's why Tom died. You know that, don't you? You let him rot, weak as you are." Her hands trembled, just for a moment, but the barrel didn't waver. Coda stepped beside her, his voice low and calm, cutting through the tension. "He's already dead, just doesn't know it yet." Silas lunged, a desperate grab for her legs. She fired. The shot exploded through his shoulder, spinning him backward into the snow with a shriek of pain. He clutched the wound, blood soaking through his coat, pooling beneath him, dark and wet. She walked over slow, deliberate, standing over him as he writhed. "You think you're free now?" He hissed up at her, his voice breaking, teeth clenched against the agony. "I know I am," she said, her words flat, final. He groaned, his head lolling back, his strength fading fast. Coda knelt beside him, pressed two fingers to his neck, feeling the weak pulse. He stood, brushing snow from his hands. "He'll live," he said, his tone matter of fact. Clara stared down at the man who'd left her to die, the man who'd taken everything and laughed while he did it. She felt nothing. No fear, no vengeance, just a cold, empty quiet like the forest after a storm. We should go, Coda said, his voice pulling her back. Others might follow his trail. She nodded, her eyes still fixed on Silas for one last moment. Leave him, she said, turning away. They grabbed rope, supplies, and a horse, leaving before the snow hid their tracks. By sundown, they reached a frozen stream. Coda built a small fire, steady and warm. Clara sat close, hands around melted snow, silent, thinking of the fight and Silas's fall. You did what you had to, Coda said, voice low. She met his eyes. No, what he forced me to. He grunted, letting it hang. I hated him, she said, voice rough. More, I hated being weak under him. Coda watched the flames. You're not her now. She stared at the fire. Who am I then? You poke the coals. You'll see. The fire crackled, their silence warm with respect. You fight good, he said later. Good teacher, she replied. He smirked. Not shooting, not fearing, she said. He nodded. Tougher lesson. Her rifle was hers now, like her scars. She lay back, eyes on the cold stars. I'm not going back. Good, he said. You know where to go. Ride with me, she said, bold. He agreed silently. Snow rustled, a wolf howled. They rested, survivors ready to ride. Next morning, sunlight cut through the trees, blue on the snow. Clara stood by her burned home. Charred beams, collapsed barn, a ruin. The smell of soot and memories hit her. Coda stayed back, giving space. This was her goodbye. She knelt by Tom's grave under a bare oak, brushing snow off. Thomas Hensley, honest. I loved you, she whispered, but I wasn't yours to keep. A raven flew overhead, silent, moving on. She stood, calm, strong, and nodded to Coda. Let's finish this. Silas's men, her tormentors, were still out there, thinking she'd fade. Ghosts don't. They rode east 3 hours through icy woods to the settlement. Clara, rifle on her back, looked reborn. Coda rode beside her, seeing her strength. At the ridge, they saw the town, smoke, wagons, tavern below. They don't expect me, she said, voice sharp. No, Coda agreed. We'll knock loud, she promised, fierce. They rode in, hooves loud, eyes turning. Thought she froze, someone hissed. She tied her horse at the tavern, doors swinging open. Inside, for men, Eli Tate, Buck Grayson, Hank Voss, and Slim Perry, froze by the stove. Slim reached for his gun. Her rifle snapped up. Don't, she warned, voice steel. They stopped. Confess or test my aim, she said clear. We followed Silas, Eli stammered. He's done, she replied. Dead, someone asked. Coda stepped in. No, bleeding. Sheriff Amos Reed babbled. Reports said you left. Lies, she snapped. You knew and did nothing. What now, he pleaded. You rebuild my home, she told the men. Or try me. They moved, cursing. Later, she watched them work her land under Coda's eye, sun low. She walked to the old smokehouse ridge, Coda following. Not staying, he said. She nodded. Too many ghosts. I'll ride with the living. Where? He asked. Where the trail turns, she said, fire in her. I'll show them a woman's worth. He smiled real. She offered her hand. He took it, a quiet pact. They rode out at dusk, horses hushed by snow, shadows trailing. No map, just a path ahead. Clara ignored the ruins and grave. She'd shed that chained, pleading woman. Now, fierce and forged, she was a rider, a survivor, a warning. Coda rode beside her, eyes glowing, silent under waking stars. Their tale of grit and revenge would haunt campfires for years. If this tale grabbed you, shook you, or lit a fire in your chest, don't let it fade. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Some stories aren't just meant to be told. They're meant to stick with you, to echo in the dark. Let's keep this one alive.